Hello, and welcome to Teambuilding 101. Today, we'll be looking at all the various types of buffs in FGO and how they interact with one another, and likewise with the associated debuffs. Please be aware that I won't go through every single buff in the game and explaining what they all do individually. That would be immensely time consuming, and you can just look that up on a wiki somewhere if you're interested. And besides, I trust you don't need me to tell you that a dodge buff will in fact let you dodge an enemy's attacks. As a rule of thumb, if you can figure out everything you need to know about a buff just by reading the in-game status screen, I'm not gonna bother bringing it up here. Instead, this video will focus on explaining how the various buffs mix and match, and how that can affect you in battle, particularly when it comes to damage calculation. To start off with, let me quickly go over overlapping buff effects. While many buffs and debuffs, like attack buffs, defense debuffs, and damage over time debuffs, will stack to increase their effect, this is not true for all of them. In many cases, if you have a certain buff or debuff active, that type of buff will no longer work on you. This includes effects such as Guts, Taunt, Dodge, Invincibility, Stun, Charm, Sure Hit, and Ignore Invincibility, among others. To give a specific example, if Leonidas has his Taunt from his first skill active, the Taunt from his Noble Phantasm will fail to trigger, shown here. This is in spite of the fact that the Taunt from his Noble Phantasm lasts 3 turns, whereas the taunt from his skill only lasts 1 turn. With that little aside out of the way, let's move on to what you're probably here for: how to buff and debuff to maximize damage, or minimize incoming damage. Broadly speaking, we can say that we have 3 main groups of damage affecting buffs, not including being immune to damage via dodge or invincibility. These are as follows: attack buffs, card performance buffs, and special buffs. The first category is the simplest. These are buffs that increase your attack, thus making you hit harder. There's not a whole lot else to them. The second category, likewise, does exactly what it tells you. It increases the performance of your cards, so a Buster performance buff will make your Buster cards hit harder, an Odds performance buff will make your Odds card hit harder and generate more NP gauge, and Quick performance buffs will make your Quick cards hit harder, generate more NP gauge, and also drop more critical stars. The last category is a bit trickier. Special buffs include NP damage buffs, critical damage buffs versus certain enemy traits like Divine or Humanoid, as well as the damage buffs you get from CEs during events like Nerofest or the Rashomon raids. You can think of those like conditional attack buffs. They increase your damage, but only under certain conditions, like when landing a critical hit or when fighting a certain enemy type. While you might not think that these have all that much in common, they are considered the same type of buff when it comes to how they affect your damage. More on that later. Debuffs likewise fit into these exact same 3 categories. There is functionally 0 difference between you having increased attack or the enemy having decreased defense, when it comes to your damage output anyway. And likewise for you having an arts performance buff or the enemy having reduced arts resistance. It's the exact same thing, just applied to the enemy instead of you. These offensive buffs also all have an opposite defensive buff. Instead of an attack buff, for example, you could have a defense buff, and instead of card performance buffs, you can have card resistance buffs, and so on. Needless to say, the same logic as before holds true here as well. There is 0 difference between having increased defense and the enemy having reduced attack. Now let's see those buffs in action. I'll be using my Okada Iso with an MLB Kaleidoscope as my main damage dealer for testing purposes, and then buffing him with the various buff types in equal measure. Please be advised that damage output in FGO is somewhat randomized, so the same result isn't always guaranteed, even with the exact same buffs. We're just looking for the general numbers here. For your information, my Okada Iso's NP with no buffs at all deals about 35 to 40,000 damage. First off, we have attack buffs, so let's have a look at that. The strategy I'm using here is one where I buff Iso twice, then use the auto chain skill to swap him out for someone else while I wait for the buffs to go off cooldown, and then I have Iso cycle back in and buff him again. Using this setup, I get Iso to exactly plus 120% attack, and a bit of flat damage added, but cut me some slack here, I'm working with what I've got. And here's the result, around 90,000 damage, which is roughly what could be expected. And just to prove that there is no difference between attack buffs and defense debuffs, here's Iso using his NP while he has plus 60% attack, and the enemy has a minus 60% defense. As you can see, the result is roughly the same. Now let's try it with Iso having his arch performance buffed instead. Unsurprisingly, we get more or less the exact same result. Now let's try it with NP damage buffs instead. And once again, we get the same result. This is because buffs of the same type stack additively, meaning they just stack on top of each other. In all of these tests, Iso was buffed by 120%, meaning he was dealing 2.2 times his damage with his Noble Phantasm. But what happens then when we mix the buff types? Let's have a look at that. In this setup, Iso gets two 30% arts buffs, one 30% NP damage buff, and one 30% attack buff. This all still totals up to 120%, but just look at the damage. Quite the difference from before, wouldn't you say? This is because buffs of different types stack multiplicatively. Rather than getting to 2.2 times damage, this setup gets Iso up to a whopping 2.7 times damage. And of course, the more buffs you add, the bigger the difference gets between additive and multiplicative buff types. I mentioned earlier that the special category of offensive buffs is a bit trickier, and that's because in spite of there being many different types of buffs included there, those all stack additively, as though they were the same type. Let's have a quick look at that. Here we have our boy Iso again, buffed up with plus 110% attack, and now also using his own Manslayer skill to give himself a further plus 100% damage against humanoid enemies. Unfortunately for this enemy, he is in fact humanoid, so he ends up taking a frankly kinda cruel 4.2 times damage from all of this. Poor guy. Now let's try that again, but this time, instead of buffing Iso's attack, we're buffing his NP damage. And the result is far less, actually. And that's because those skill types stack additively with one another, meaning Iso only gets to deal a pathetic 3.1 times damage. And this is why you're not a Saber, Iso. This same thing holds true for critical damage, by the way. Here we have Orion hitting with plus 200% critical damage and his own plus 100% damage against melee enemies. Meanwhile, if we replace that damage against melee enemies with an equivalent attack buff, the result becomes much better. That first hit dealt 4 times damage, while the second one was all the way up to 6 times damage. I should also mention that this same principle of mixing buff types also applies to things like NP generation and critical star drop rate. You're better off mixing them than you are stacking the same buff type, showcased here by Archer Shun. Here you see her NP generation with only arts buffs, and here you see it with NP generation buffs and arts buffs. Now let's cover defense. Suffice it to say that the same stuff still holds true, but with one key difference. Now you want to stack your buffs additively. Don't mix and match them, stick to one category if you can. This is because when you reduce damage with one type of buff, and then reduce it again with a different one, you are essentially reducing the amount of damage you've already reduced, not the full amount of damage. Here's a specific example. If we reduce this enemy's attack by 50% and increase Giorgio's defense by 50%, it will deal 0 damage to him. At least for one hit, because it removes buffs, but don't worry about that. Meanwhile, if we use Nightingale to cut an enemy's attack in half, and also cut its NP damage in half, we're actually not getting rid of the full damage. We're cutting the full damage in half, and then cutting the half damage in half again, so we end up with a quarter damage. But how do defensive buffs interact with offensive buffs, you might be asking? Well, if they're of the same type, like defense buffs and attack buffs, they subtract from each other. For example, if you have plus 100% attack, and the enemy has plus 50% defense, you'll end up with plus 50% attack. If they're not of the same type, however, then the game will calculate your full damage, with buffs included, and then reduce that damage by the defensive buff afterwards. Here's an example of that. In this conveniently timed challenge quest, we have an enemy with drastically increased buster resistance. My NP5 Abby is only able to deal just about 10k against it with a buffless NP, and even that's factoring in her passive 8% buster performance buff. If we increase her attack by 90%, that 10k jumps to around 20k. Likewise for if we buff her NP damage by 90%, as shown here. However, here's what happens if we buff her buster performance. As you can see, it's quite the difference. This is because the monkey's buster resistance, which I estimate to be about 90% or so, is essentially taking the full damage and reducing it to a sliver. If we buff Abby with NP damage or attack buffs, it'll still do that. That sliver just gets bigger. If we buff her Buster performance, however, her Buster performance buff and the enemy's Buster resistance buff will essentially cancel each other out instead. In other words, if an enemy has a defensive buff that you can't outright ignore, you'll actually want to specifically buff the opposite offensive buff so you can directly overpower their defensive buff. Now, to quickly recap. On offense, you'll want to mix and match your buff types, while on defense, you'll want to stick to one type if you can. If an enemy has a defensive buff that you can't ignore, you'll want to overpower it by giving yourself the opposite offensive buff. And that'll be all for this episode. Be seeing ya!
お果てにお目にかかります。じゃあ、わしは剣の天才だ。チェソー